Ja, einen schönen guten Abend auch von mir
Good
in nah und
evening from
fern,
me, both near and far,
Trauer und Behinderung.
talking about
Zwei, die sich
disability,
sehr nahe sind, wie wir
two
vorhin schon ein
things
Stück
which are
gehört haben, wie wir es
very
jetzt noch ein Stück weiter hören. Aber wirklich zunächst einmal der Dank noch einmal zurück, dass man überhaupt diesem Thema
address this theme here, that we are for so many years we've overlooked it. Or I could say, look at myself in my whole psychiatric work, that there are certainly many who I can think about who perhaps 15, 20, 25 years ago I experienced and whose true needs were not understood. Because we have this concept of trauma has become ever more clear over the years. I think that with a lecture from Bernd Rulf and mine now, perhaps also what's coming tomorrow and the day after, I think trauma is a theme with variations. We are always, again and again, going to find similar aspects and also have other ways of approaching it. And the other thing is, I think, and I find the same thing in music, the theme of repetition. Repetition is never the same. It can only be the thing, but I'm in a repetition, maybe a little quieter, more pronounced. Other elements are perhaps brought into the foreground. And that, I think, is what will also happen today and tomorrow when we address the question regarding trauma and disability. In my view, as a psychiatrist, the accompanying of people who need assistance, people who have cognitive disabilities, who in my descriptions will be in the foreground, because that is what I have been professionally involved with for many years, and most of which I have to deal with as well. It appeared earlier on that people who are traumatized carry the symptoms in the way they speak about it, not on the same way. We have to hear, we have to listen into them and try to listen more deeply and to understand. And the one thing I would like to really emphasize, which has already been in the space, we have to learn many languages. So in the context of trauma and emergency education, there are many other different languages come to this. So sweating, an epileptic fit. This is the language which in this realm we have to learn to understand and read. That we know that these people can also be affected by soul illness is not so old. And I think in this field, there are also other psychological illnesses more readily recognized in the context of the work with people with special needs. And then those which are related to traumatization. It's now, there's a book presented about psychological disorders. And there he writes, 10 years ago, in the last 10 years, the treatment and diagnosis of people was caught up with over the last 10 years, where we really want to emphasize that people with an intellectual impediment have soul disturbances like anybody else. That is well known today and broadly accepted. I would think that we are just beginning the path, because just like many other people too. And I would like to make a little diversion here for the question, for instance, regarding a psychotic illness and psychosis. We know these symptoms of hallucination, hearing voices, and so thinking of things that are not there. This very difficult mood changes which these people with a psychosis experience. The change, the disquiet, or the apathy, all these symptoms which are known. But when I then come to this language, what is it when a person cannot find the words, or perhaps have only one or two sentences and nothing else? So when a person, perhaps I've experienced in their 20s, not he only feel that he changed, became quieter, more rings under his eyes, withdrew, and he couldn't say what was actually wrong. And quite by chance, that there was light in his room in the middle of the night. And for weeks, so for a long time, we began to find out that at nighttime he stood before his bed, standing in front of his bed in the belief that his pillow was burning. So this crazy thought, so he wouldn't actually go to bed and go to sleep. And gradually we can recognize these symptoms and also find it in other people who are subjected to this psychosis. With a person here, perhaps somebody with a great deal of intellectual hindrance, or another very big soul illness in depression, with thinking, feeling, and feeling about all the psychological illnesses, the narrowing down of the thoughts, the circulating of thoughts, the repressed feelings, these symptoms. But experiencing this, we perhaps on people, perhaps one has one's own experience, which perhaps becoming auto-aggressive, who destroys his radio, pulls the pictures on the walls and destroys, and through a very slow question, you begin to find that it seems that there is a depressive symptom behind it, or all the great forms of fear. How should a person who cannot express it, that he's living under great anxiety, how should he express this? Who perhaps in an image, who has his back to the wall, you could say, and cannot fight back or to express what he's experiencing, perhaps, and can only do so through aggressive behavior. And often, and very often, this behavior is written down with the concept of behavioral disorder and then sent into a therapeutic backway. And this recognition of the psychological illnesses are present in everybody is the aspect of which can open great many doors and will continue to open. And so, of course, also in the relation to a traumatization and the traumatic consequences. We need, in order to come closer to this and try to understand it, to understand what the other person experienced, we need two approaches. And I would like before that I would like to keep those two apart at the moment. Or we must really try to enter into the other person. And Karl Jaspers, this philosopher and psychiatrist, described it in the following way. We need to have this, we need to grasp an understanding to be able to see while understanding. So I think it's a very difficult sentence, but I haven't found it in a better way than in Jasper's words. There is a possible being presence within and on the other person in a trying to transform oneself in a kind of acting way to enter the substance. So when I read this, I always think of Bruno Ganz, the long dead player who entering into the movement of another person in order to make him manifest. So just like in an actor, that is something which is more in a more condensed way, say. He says there is a non-violence of devotional hearing of the foundation, an non-violentness. So I would try to enter myself into another person. I was always asking myself, am I allowed to? Am I allowed to come closer, to understand you from inside? There is a wonderful devotional listening into process that also I am in myself. The quote, which I put together in a handout, so you can take it with you later for those who would like to have it. You will find it also on the internet. We're going a little stage further. With the so this actually encourages the making present of what one is experiencing. So it is a source of being able to observe and gain knowledge. Cool and togetherness belong together and not oppose one another. Sort of cool observation does not see the being of it, where both in an interactive together can lead to knowledge. The decisive thing is to how the experience is taken hold of. So this feeling into and then understanding what I know when I have entered into this other person. And when I see the symptoms of a psychosis, then perhaps I see, perhaps he is standing before this burning pillow. He has this perception. So that is perhaps a hallucination, a psychosis. And that is only half of the truth. What does he actually experience through doing that? And out of these two aspects, we can develop the therapeutic approach. For therapy means to serve, how we can serve the other one. Empathy is part of this, but this concerns going beyond empathy. In a letter, 1915, Rudolf Steiner wrote these words: "You can only be something for the other ones when you can enter into the inner part of the other one." So that means standing in the shoes of the other one in order to understand them, as the Indian said. If I really want to help somebody else, I have to really more understand about him. But above all, I must understand what he has understood. That is the basis, actually, which underpins every aspect to really learn to know everyone anew.
Sie bremsen mich wieder, wenn es zu schnell ist. Den Text hatten Sie ja bekommen zum Übersetzen. Ja. Also wenn ich mich in die schillernde...
When I go in the world and of the traumatized person, enter into that person, it is always anew. So when we try to approach this, you find a trauma just as with a disabled person as well as those with a non-disabled person, but the threshold of it is lower. It is very simple themes, definitions which open this up. One on one hand from a doctor, so Rederman, so for 20 years ago, very strongly took up an understanding of trauma, and the other from a child psychiatrist. The definition of the doctor is under a traumatic experience, we understand the situation is overweening and therefore leads to becoming extremely helpless. Apart from this, one experiences feelings of panic, fear of death, and sickness. The situation becomes overpowering and one feels extremely powerless. And the other definition is a trauma is a vital discrepancy between threatening situational factors and the individual capacities for overcoming it, of helplessness. And so a permanent shaking down of one's self-confidence. That is only part, but a very important part, but only a part of that which is happening from outside. How does a person deal with this in relation to perhaps not only what kind of strategies for dealing with it, but also how is it accompanied? Is he alone in the situation? Does he find support? So when a person does not have such a strategy, he comes very early, this over-demanding state overcomes him and becomes much more threatening, with the consequence that the person is helpless and without protection. And that is a point which is characteristic for people with an intellectual problem. We will go into this further later, that it is also what a seemingly harmless situation already has this over-demanding situation for this person. At core, we are then already by the question. We could say the decisive cause why people with lesser intellectual capacities are more highly traumatized is actually to do with the disability itself. And in order that there's no misunderstanding here, disability is not a trauma, not at all. Also, disability is not an illness as well, because it really is not the case. So I am who I am, whether I've got Down syndrome, and I can actually only agree with that. But the threshold to illness, to actually take on other psychological illnesses, that threshold is lower, and also significantly lower. Very few, this theme with variations, a few more aspects. I will try and focus on what is essential. The cause of the conditions for a traumatization. The natural event is also significant, especially when it is this great event. So it was referred to earlier. I can really confirm this, that they can be much better dealt with than those which have been caused by people who one should have trust in. And so the traumatization is far greater. That that the immediate experience of a crime is far more difficult to overcome, especially when it is repeated. They can really have a lasting effect on life. Sexual abuse and violence over a certain period of time, for instance, and of course, especially when when this happens within the family, in that place where a person needs to learn resilience. So there where the foundations of experience of security is created, which has very much hangs together with the first experiences that are made. And then a person suffers not only, in inverted commas, not only from a traumatic event, but at the same time, the ground is taken away from his trust, under his feet for the trust. And one can then really find oneself in a situation where we have to say, the time will not heal everything. For a whole lifelong experience, the whole life can be shattered by this experience. Sometimes we can't even distinguish between whether this has already happened, whether there was already an intellectual disability, or whether it appeared later. I remember a child which I met at 3 years old. The father had killed the mother. The child had to stay with the dead mother for 3 days before the situation was recognized. And this child was for years and years with whatever measures which was to accompany him in a kind of absolute frozen. So that was, the question was beforehand, was there already a kind of disability or not? Because we couldn't actually clarify this from the family beforehand and so on. But anyway, this trauma can go so deep that it can have a lasting effect on the further development. But there is one realm which I would like to bring here, because it's our particular realm, and that is the area of sexual violence and the big event of emotional abuse. So the emotional traumatization is much more quieter, less dramatic, often invisible to the surroundings. Neglect, lack, loss of elementary relationships, the missing of basic needs. These are the elements which really stand behind this the emotional trauma. Children can sense that violence is unjust and it's wrong. Even if they can't verbalize it, they can sense it, that what is now being done is not right. But this emotional violence is in quite a different way coming to them, because they have no way of correcting it. They have nothing on which they can compare. They live, they feel as though perhaps they are guilty, perhaps as though they had deserved it. So we're thinking about the withdrawal of love, that belongs to this. And because children are not really able to know what they should have as a child, and so that this deprivation and what this means, they don't understand it. And so the consequence of this emotional trauma is often, perhaps in adulthood, perhaps later on in adulthood, becomes clear. So all these symptoms, and that was already in Bernd Ruff's lecture, they generally appear, and this is also occur with people who have an intellectual disability. So this word from Anton Dosen, for people who have an intellectual hindrance, have psychiatric problems like all other people. And when I now come to the symptoms, which are perhaps show themselves in this whole broad field of discussion, it is above all fear as a central symptom. And perhaps we can always say a little bit, many of these symptoms of a traumatized person, we have the tendency to remain in that for a long time. So for what has been spoken about trauma treatment with this background, that this expanded over days, months, years, even decades to the symptoms and the therapies. And here is the symptoms. Above all is the fear. So fear is something which is so expressive. So there was a Dutchman who wrote a very significant book. The Embodied Shock is the title of this book. And in this title is a very helpful, I could say. So an embodied shock. Fear is something which is when a person too early on has to experience what he can't control. That is where it embodies itself. As in the inner part of one's brain. It is our fear center in our brain. Everything in our body, every move, every limb, every thought, which is somewhere in the body, has a little place in the brain, and also fear, like a little almond seed. That is the fear center. And this fear center is in a continual, in heightened activity. And the perception, the processing of perceptions is then made more difficult because always there is a basic a level of anxiety. But there are a few further areas where this brain works in. So we have a little area which is a little bit like a seahorse, hippocampus, and that is the area we need to learn something. What does it mean to learn? That means to make something inward, to make it one's own. This hippocampus remains small then. That it has the capacity for learning is made more difficult. And when this comes together with a person with a particular intellectual gift, perhaps a woman at the end of 40s, for a co-worker came into her room. There was no verbal communication of what actually happened. Perhaps through another inhabitant, it became clear that the co-worker was in her room. But to say he will never come again, he was judged, he's in the prison and so on, he'll never come again. But nonetheless, she was in a continuous state of fear. She can't sit down, she can't sleep, she feels exhausted, sleeps and wakes up again. Of course, many different measures, but this fear one can't understand. The third area, that is the frontal part of our brain. of the cortex. This is the region that we need in order to undertake something and carry out what we have decided to do, and which is also has a further function of being able to quieten down this little almond stone. So these three areas of our brain, which can have experienced a burden through an earlier trauma. So we know today that the brain is not finished, but that the brain can continue to develop and mature, that this center can become calmed down again, other areas can begin to grow over many years, over many, many years. So fear, that is the central issue. And the second thing which has come up as well, the concept of the 4 Fs, fight, flight, and fear. And when that isn't possible, and when it's dependent on development for those who have an intellectual disability, which can only develop to a certain extent, then it comes to this point of this freezing quality. So that is the starting point then for what we call dissociation and fragmentation. This splintering, which is broken into the shell sheaths of the human being. The earlier it happens, the more greater this splintering occurs. And very often, this form of dissociation are so very difficult to recognize and often misdiagnosed. That is a big problem. Somebody who was just so demanding, who stepped back and was no longer able to react. And sometimes it is much more easier to recognize this dissociation when it is related to vegetative symptoms, with becoming pale or whatever, or digestive problems. But suddenly when it appears, it is often very difficult to recognize, like many symptoms, which I will say, as I said at the beginning, to enter into the inner nature of the other person. I begin to experience that symptom along with that person, and thereby understand the inner place where that person is actually standing. So we need to have this view from outside to understand the symptom. And we speak today not about autism, but we speak about the autistic spectrum, about autistic disorders, but I find the autistic spectrum much more fitting. And I think we can also speak about trauma spectrum. It's not all the same symptoms, but these symptoms which as we experience in this whole spectrum where they belong. And there are the elements, these varied forms of fear and this splintering, this dissociation, this stepping back, this being unreachable by other people, these core symptoms. And I think I would like to say it a bit more clear what I earlier tried to say. If I am together with another person and try to don't quite understand what he's doing, how he's behaving, I cannot look into him, and I can perhaps sense that in me there is something like fear, perhaps no reason that I would have any fear, but I also a mirror for the other one. Everyone mirrors themselves with his own state of being. Perhaps this fear in me can begin to sense and perhaps sense, can I recognize the fear in the other one? Can I now experience his or her fear? Do I experience this dissociation, this lack of grounding in the other one in me? from outside, the view from inside and from outside. That is something which is a continuous process which I try to do. I first experienced this form of dissociation. I've had many years before I could really understand what this was about. A child who was 5 years old in our family, and when we read the prehistory of his life, and later on we experienced that in his 3rd or 4th year he had undergone a sexual abuse, that was this emotional life appeared in all sorts of hungry things in the clinic. So I listened to these conditions and I found him extremely helpless. There is a person who is there and no longer reachable, is not there. And that stops for many, many hours or days. Until then, through the measures and conditions which have arisen around it, it becomes a little bit less. How perhaps this never completely stopped in the 40 years I've known him. So the trauma spectrum, this intrusion of this memory of something experienced a long time ago, as though it were now, as though it were real and current, and in all the flashback, like a flash of actually it's made it present. So it overcomes all the other experiences. And here again, the person who cannot express it, who suddenly becomes frozen or to sweat, or stands with shock lifting his arm. So when I have this picture in me, that could be, and so perhaps other things added to this, which perhaps in order to get a picture of it, that could be a form of former trauma, a trauma disorder. So when I'm working with people in social therapy and in curative education, that co-workers say, I would like to know something about, I don't want to know anything about the prehistory of this person I'm working. On one side, I can understand it. I don't want to have any prejudgments of them. And yet, nonetheless, I try to motivate the co-workers to actually get to know this. Don't let the other person fall on the knife before you find out it. It's something very different when you know what has happened to this person before he comes to you, and then try to approach him in ever new ways. That's also true in the partnership. You can never say, now I know this person. No. Do I really know him? Can I still get to know them a little better? And so I think it is also, this is what applies here when with the question of trauma, could also call upon us to have a picture of the earlier biography about the possible wounds that the other one has had to gone through. That is something different when I know that this person and many of the adult special needs people that perhaps in the first 3 or 4, 6 months were living in an incubator without any human contact, closeness. Today, there is another kind of awareness for this, but many of those today who are adults who perhaps have a brain damage or something in their childhood, or had a heart operation which was necessary, that this great loneliness, it is something different when I know this and try to then come close to the other person. There are many symptoms. I will leave it to this point. I would like to go on a little bit further. Why I think the disability is such a significant starting point. I think 3 or 4 times people with need of assistance are suffering from trauma in the population. Perhaps we can come to these 2 quotes, that the situation can be overwhelming and leads to one becoming totally helpless, and that there is a vital discrepancy between threatening situational factors and the individual capacity for overcoming them. So the one thing actually appeared earlier on, we have to make it clear. And so I take this word as well. Have I understood what the other one has understood? And the cognitive capacity for grasping it, for overcoming it. That is the second thing. The second thing is the lack of ability to act. Barbara Senkler had written this book, You Are a Spreading Tree, about working with people who have a significant intellectual incapacity. It comes to this many relationship disorders with such a person has experienced through their life. Perhaps I just take a couple of things. She speaks about the lack of valuing or being able to rely on someone or separate. You just have to think of somebody who's been in the institution. If a person who's come in is perhaps the 163rd person, always left. And when it is happening very early on in life, you can actually enter into this experience and then become clear that what wounds must have been opened in this. The devaluation, the sort of excluding, the control, the limitation or preventing of self-determination, and the perspectivelessness, lack of perspective. But there's also a third thing which belongs here, and that is the weakness of stimulus processing, the processing of stimuli. So the world comes from outside, but also stimuli come from inside, from the body. And until that is all processed and controlled, when something is coming from outside and something from inside, and then we notice that somewhere they come back into balance, that is again is back in order. But if there this weakness on the processing of this experience is, if that threshold is lower, then it can become quite a central aspect. Because this control and processing of the stimuli, a lot of things are built up on our own self-security in order to achieve our own balance. There are people in need of support who they don't understand, they think they can't work on it, and so they become into a situation which is life-threatening and over demands on them. So this evolutionary solution which are then offered, sort of fleeing or becoming aggressive or pretending to be dead, that is not available. And so this different life experience then become traumatizing experiences. It could be medical interventions, or a person with too early birth or too early investigations. or a child living too long in an incubator. So such thing, the trusted stimuli can be not be really live in the right way. And also, I would like to take this up again, this special form of emotional trauma, because there are parents who have a thriving disorder. They are really called upon to try and understand this child much more strongly. And the anxiety about existence, and of course can stress the parents, and they can feel helpless. And how quickly does this threshold, not only one night when they don't sleep because the child doesn't sleep. If this is month after month, when does it reach this threshold? And when they try to work this, how quickly that can really come to an overreaction, which the child's experienced of being left alone or perhaps experience violence. And even more strongly, even in a situation, a pre-verbal state, when they don't even can find words for that which they've experienced. A few years ago, the minister responsible for special needs people made a very shocking summary and came to the fact that 70% of people with a medium special needs had experienced significant violence. That is a huge number. At least 1/3 had experienced sexual abuse. So this is the spectrum of sexual violence, is something which is very significant in the care of people with an intellectual disability or those with special needs. Sexual violence is a huge spectrum. Again, it begins with a very supportive process, which is really in the most intimate sphere is protected. Is this intimate intimate touch is perhaps where it begins, but or perhaps even smaller, apparently smaller interventions. A young, lively woman suffers from a kind of a touch from a person went with her to the toilet and touched her in the wrong place, and leads to the fact that for many years, decades even, led to a great freezing of emotions, because this moment could not be ordered and understood. Perhaps a moment with a 30-year woman, a Down syndrome. For 10 years in her institution, through the group father, had to suffer sexual advances. She described it. This is sexual torture. She took her mattress onto the street in order to sleep on the street. For 10 years, it wasn't heard what she had said. So listen, take seriously. Is it perhaps true what she said? Is it no fantasy? which is standing behind it. And of course, it is a very difficult field in this area. And the special needs situation creates a particular difficulty here. It is very more difficult to say no. And of course, the situation is two-sided. Tenderness is offered, but also very strongly the feeling that the personal boundary is stepped over, and that is not wanted. And this dancing on the street is a language, is a part of this language which we have to learn again and again. So I've quite spoken about people with an early childhood brain damage and an affected brain development. And this perhaps to do with chromosomal different changes, which I would like to take. The one is, which is again and again reappearing, people who have a Down syndrome, which are often very open, warm-hearted people with open hearts. Perhaps their body is often, their heart is not quite, is too open, if you like, in any case, in these Down syndrome people. They have this open-heartedness, and that's what makes them so vulnerable. So that in the background, we need to know that they are, in this particular place, they're over-challenged when this open-heartedness is wounded. So these are people who have this 2X syndrome, so a very thin, vulnerable skin, which you can never go to speak to directly, but always go from the side and take them along, because the level of wounding so quickly occurs. And those are the people who are known of with the so-called Angelman syndrome, who don't have any active language, but are always smiling. But the more they come under stress they become, the more they smile and chuckle. And it's good when we know that in order to protect them and not to see this chuckling as openness, but this is also a kind of experience of vulnerability. And another group is also in relation to, relating to this fleeing, running away. I've experienced it in a whole number of people from Syria with an autistic background. People who, in becoming them, need rhythm, or this formative rhythm, this ritual element that needs to be to give them more security. So which Johannes Boccamühl wrote this rhythm. So it's rhythm must, in order to make that clear. We need this rhythm, and the ritual has something of this. And it is wonderful to experience then these children, as we experience in the Waldorf school, where the course of the day is actually rhythmically structured. The day, the week, the year, for annual festivals. But the children who are coming to us from other countries, I have experienced mostly with children from Syria and Eritrea who have a certain autistic background, who have been really shocked and traumatized that their whole security, their ground was taken away from them and had to be found again. That is something what I would like to refer to, that this group needs our awareness to a great extent. And also for people with a physical disability. I don't want to go into much further, but just one aspect from Karl Koenig, the founder of the Camp Hill movement, and in a wonderful work which these institutions have brought about, he referred on the relationship between lameness and fear, anxiety, and that we can try to enter into a lamed person who doesn't have the space behind me. I can look back quickly and then have the security, but a person who is lame cannot do it. The space behind him is not available to him. And so Koenig said, watch this and look at the fear of this person and don't wound it. But never forget to see it not only from outside, but how I can enter into this experience. For the bridge now to therapy. But I would like to bring something in between. This in between came to me with my work with people needing assistance of every age in the last years, became ever more clear to me. And that is the emotional development of a person. And this emotional development of a person, this circumscribes the need for relationships that exists. That also builds on what was previously described, the Anton Dawson and his co-worker. And he once wrote, I just want to sketch it here. It is very worthwhile entering into this in order to understand the inner aspects of the other person better. He describes the development and puts it in steps. The first half year, then 1 year, then 1.5, then 4 years, and 3 and 7 years, 18 years, and so on. He puts it in steps, and each step he tries to find what relationship needs does a half-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old child need. And then he brings this into connection with people who need a special assistance with these various stages. In South Germany, there are very few stationary institutes. One of the important places, the Lucas place near Regensburg, who have been working with this concept for many years. And then when you meet a person with an emphasized psychological illness, bring them into this center, then the people do not come, first of all, with a diagnosis of whatever it might be, but with the stage of emotional development which they have been engaged with. So the way of approach and how one actually creates a milieu which is not over demanding for these people. I come back once again to this Barbara Zenke's words. We need, in accompanying these wounded people, we need more than an education. One could also write it with 2 E's and making an ocean of willingness. But it is also something that Rudolf Steiner said to us doctors with the words, the healing will. But we need also, and that is the other word which Barbara Zenke said, we need a differentiated psychological knowledge that allows phased development. When I know this, that the curative course, which Rudolf Steiner gave as the foundation for curative education, right at the beginning, he said, it is, of course, naturally the approach of every incompletely developed child. It is always knowledge, a part of a penetrating understanding of the education of healthy children that we need. So when we use this as an instrument, where does the other one stand? In order then to address this relationship and to give a support in the emotional development of that age group. So we are then right in the middle of therapy, because this in the development stage of the development of connection and relationship, this is absolutely central. When I then say one or two aspects to therapy, I don't start off with saying, is this a child or an adult? I don't think, is this a first-time traumatized person, or is it a repeated one? All that is in the background and perhaps looked at in other spaces. But I want to just like to lift out of this to see what is essential here. And what I think is never, in which I think about, never should be forgotten, but should always be sought. That is the creation of a safe space. I think that is the sine qua non, to always try to find this in the place, to really find, to interpret for this particular person in this situation, to find the safe place. And this safe place has got three levels. It is an external place, is outside, perhaps. So where there's no more trauma can take place. So that needs to be a safe place in that sense. But it is also the place in the classroom. Is the child safer when it's in the front near the teacher or at the back? It is the room next to the night watchman or somewhere else. Is it a shared room or a single room, which is better? Always look for in that particular situation. I remember a woman in a workshop who had suffered from a lot of violence. She had her weaving loom in the middle. When somebody went by behind, turned round and was very aggressive out of fear, until the workshop leader came and said, perhaps I shall put her at the edge, so she is in the corner, so nobody goes behind. And that was a safe place. So if I always interpret in a new way what the safe space is. And of course, a part of the safe place is the connection, the reliable connection. So where you're looking forward and say, well, let's look at this and do this tomorrow. No randomness, but to give security in the relationship. And even though I am the 160th person that comes in, I am the one who is trying to create this secure place. So I do my own training further, of course, and so on. And then it comes, if it is possible. But the reliability in the relation is, of course, a second part of this. And the third section that is one's own body. That I think we know this, what that feeling is of security, when I am properly in myself. When I am feel properly connected with my body, what security that gives me. And this body is often that which is wounded, which makes the relationship of the soul to the body so difficult. That is, the body as a safe place is even more strongly, we have to go, may I come closer? I remember on the development of a child in this way, 9-year-old had suffered a lot of violent abuse as a child. We came into the therapeutic circle and we wanted to offer a massage. No, thank you. She had vehemently said no. For a whole year, she lay in the sack in the therapeutic center, but of course was in the hangomat, in the cot. So there is in the swing that a person helps to bring a person to themselves is being alone in the presence of others. So she simply lived that. And then in the second year, we could even then come to the next place and work with the hand to gradually massage the hand. And she disappeared back on the swing. And then comes to read a little bit, leave alone in the presence of others. And in all these measures of body therapy, there is this wonderful from Teresa von Evelo. Do your body good so that your soul likes to live there, but listen into it. So the curative course of Rudolf Steiner is built on a basic motif. I just want to bring one element, and this basic motif is point and circle. The point is a circle, the circle is the point. I want to bring this element forward in a very short situation, so I had to have a concept for the whole context as well. A girl, Samantha, she lived two floors above my doctor's surgery. I also had to go down the stairs. Often met her. I'm relatively tall. She's quite small. She's a man. She had a girl. We had to pass each other, and we all waited until she was above me. And then I spoke to her and said, "How are you?" Later on, she became my assistant. I'm quite like to have a youngster with me who to write a little bit for me. Can you write down the name? She was a wonderful assistant and helped me. And I knew that in this moment, this half minute that we had on the stairs, that is a point where it touches this circle. It's no longer about how are you, but it's only about the whole, my consciousness of the whole. This girl then struggles then to have a deeper feeling for her own body. And Rudolf Steiner condensed this in the lectures when he came to this meditation of point and circle. He said, from the devotion to small things, not to actually value the small in the context of the whole. So this belongs to this therapeutic milieu. And so it is the beginning of therapy. And certainly something belongs to it, like the Dutch resistance fighter expressed, fear, courage is fear that has prayed. Courage is fear that has prayed, which actually is most connected with this creating a protective space, safe space. And where is it to give the child a control possibility? In their development, a person has never had this protection, this ability to control in the right moment. And so we have to approach all these people who have experienced trauma. They have a great need for control, and that can be very nervy, but it's necessary. And that is something which we have to let it be. So I have to make sure it doesn't happen again. Joy is a need that also occurred much earlier on. An elemental basic therapeutic need, joy, whether it is a picture here in such a thing or a diary that was so wonderfully stood there at the center before. And all this is that is all something which actually can shake ourselves out of this crisis. We cannot shake ourselves out of it, but we can shake others. And that, of course, is what we can do in the world of, in this emergency education, to actually shake these people so much so that it doesn't become embodied shock. And we have to do this over years and decades, and we do this and try to make this overcoming possible. There, of course, psychotherapy. There is very little therapists who work with assistance required, people with special needs. But with this eye movement therapy, there is particularly there for people with a intellectual disability, because this shimmering of the two right eyes helps to bring inward, bring down and overcome the dissociations. This, of course, therapeutic measures which are specific, which particular therapists work in trauma. But all other methods where we left and right can bring into connection, whether it is running or dancing, these are all methods which help to in this processing, and also all kinds of artistic therapies. And what I have just said about the massage, that applies to every therapy. Every therapy, I see it also the therapists, and they say, you cannot, we can no longer do painting or singing and so on. That is a specific therapy. That doesn't apply. You were together. You have a one-to-one situation. So that is a fundamental therapeutic situation. That is wonderful. When you sit on the bank, perhaps it doesn't work, then go through the woodland. And then you can sit down somewhere that you can tell something, just remain in contact in this relationship. And that is what all of these artistic therapies have. And to this, the specific possibility of the therapy then comes to that. Medicines, of course, also belong there. Anthroposophical medicine has, of course, a wonderful basic with bryophyllum and silver and amnion and arnica and so on, which we can use. And of course, if it is necessary and the anxiety becomes too great, also use antidepressants. So there's a whole area which is available to us. And again, and this is very therapeutic element, that when we notice that we're coming to a kind state of over-demanding situation, perhaps coming into a flashback situation, that we then consciously step back, take back from the demands and take them back a little bit. There's this wonderful words in the analytical therapy, regression in the service of progress. So to step back from the demands into an earlier childlike needs, and then when it is possible to go forward into the demands of life. In order then, again and again, this is something which is very carrying, and this is very decisive, to take the life forces along and strengthen them. And regression, when I think of these three stages of the first 3 years, 7 years, that the world is good. That is the first. Everything is good. Everything is good. Only when we have that. And when we've got this one, then the world is beautiful. Beauty connects the eye with the body, the aesthetics. And then the world is true. That is the next one, when that is going. But when this all breaks down, then you begin again. The world is good. Everything is okay. We are here. You must now be here in this situation. Have no fear. I know that is still there, but in this mood, that is what it's about. I don't speak at all about self-care. That is a whole chapter in itself, and that it is needed in the accompanying of traumatized, so that it doesn't become a secondary traumatization. There also needs to be a caring for oneself. I just mention it because it is always there at the beginning and is in the center. That the helper is a supporter, an accompanier for the self-care of the person. I would like to conclude with a poem, which is always a big help for me in the inner accompanying and external accompanying as well from traumatized people. And that is the poem from Hilde Domin. I don't know what intention she wrote this, but I could see such a lot in it, in the theme and the needs. We are submerged and washed with the waters of the flood. We are soaked to the skin. To the skin of the heart. We are soaked to the skin of the heart. The desire for landscape, this side of tears, is worth nothing. We have crossed this boundary of the tears. The wish, the desire for landscape, this side of the boundary of tears, is worth nothing. The wish to be spared does not count. The flowers pass, are transient. The wish to be spared does not count. What is worth is calling that the dove at dawn may bring the olive branch, that the fruit may be as colorful as flowers, that even the rose leaves on the ground form a shining crown. So the width, the peonies that we see, and we look down and see all these petals that are lying on the ground. But even the rose leaves on the ground form a shining crown. And that from the flood, from the lion's den and the fiery oven, we are released to ourselves, ever maimed and ever healed. So this is the possibility of growth. Amazing how this poet brings this consciousness of the consciousness soul, ever more vulnerable and ever more healed. We are released ever more to ourselves. I put that on the script for you. And that is what I would like to conclude with. I would like to bring my young assistants. You don't have to understand me. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. First of all, thank you very much for this presentation tonight, for this theme in variation. It was I would like to bring one theme. One point is this whole question of the point and circle. Point and circle. I spoke about Karlsruhe before, about the point and the circle is also the basic principle of the architecture of the town. A town which was built for Caspar Hauser, I said so provocatively, and Karl Koenig had brought Caspar Hauser as a question, as though he were the inspirer of the curative course for Rudolf Steiner. You can see the drawings of Karl Koenig in the Karl Koenig Institute. The second is the question of the safe place. So that is the basic question. From the structures and from the relationships, from the individual interventions, where actually the whole human being is shaken and have a breakdown of experience. How can he come to new relationships? How is it in the surroundings? How is it on the physical basis, physical surroundings? How is it in the etheric astral body? And also on the level of the eye and in the spiritual surroundings around us. How do we manage on all these levels to create safe spaces? And the last thing I would like to say for today is that it was impression what you have said to us. But far more significant for me was the inner attitude which you spoke of. That really was moving for me, because in your presentation, we have seen the method, how out of the attitude, a diagnosis is possible. So thank you very much for this contribution.